All right, everybody, Dr. O again. Here is our last unit. This first chapter, chapter 22, is about evolutionary theories. So let's go ahead and jump in. What is the theory of evolution? We could talk forever about that, but evolution is the natural process that's oftentimes unpredictable that, if given enough time, will lead to changes, new species, genetic modification, these kind of things. So it's the system where genetic mutations are tested, basically, and lead to new species or changes in current species, these kind of things. So the best way for me to define it, rather than just define the word, is the next point. What are the three key elements of the theory of evolution? Number one is descent over time. So a couple things. That means that that organisms can pass on their genetic traits, and then over time, organisms with better traits are going to become more common, and organisms that have inferior traits are going to become less common. So that's the first part. Number two, the second key element is genetic modification. And what that means is the fact that we're not all the same. If every human being or every rat or whatever were identical, then there wouldn't be kind of winners and losers. There wouldn't be advantages or disadvantages. If we all had there's so many things. If we all have the same IQ, then there wouldn't be any selection pressure on having a higher or lower IQ, these kind of things. So we know that evolution takes time. We know that over time, traits are going to be passed on, and some are going to be chosen for, and some are going to be left behind. We believe that 99% of all species that have ever existed have gone extinct. So to me, evolution is, or if your environment changes, you only have one of two options: to adapt to that new environment or go extinct. So every species, including humans, is either adapting to their environment or they're heading towards extinction. So we could talk about which way. I honestly think that we're not heading. I don't think we're going extinct anytime soon. But on that continuum, I think we're becoming less genetically fit, not more. So you can make the argument that we're heading towards the extinction end of that spectrum. What I mean by that is just because there really isn't much selection pressure. All of us have a fair shot at surviving and reproducing, which is great. But from an evolutionary standpoint, you could argue that it's not. So, all right. So the first key element, descent over time. Second key element, genetic modification. And the word you're going to see is alleles. The fact that we all have human genes, but there are different variants of those genes. So skin color, for example. If we all had the same skin color, there wouldn't be any advantage or disadvantage depending on where you lived. So having darker skin color is a huge advantage near the equator, where there's lots of sun exposure to protect you from too much sun exposure, sunburn, skin cancer, these kind of things. But if you live in the Scandinavian countries and you have a very dark skin color, you're going to have a hard time making vitamin D. Hey, buddy. Hold on just a second, everybody.
We're going to go to the reading pool.
Oh, you're going to go. See you, buddy.
Why do you always need the door closed?
Just when I'm doing this, buddy. I love you. Sorry about that, guys. My little boy's heading to the wading pool. So I was talking about skin color. So, of course, skin color is a whole can of worms for lots of reasons, and they're all terrible in my opinion. There's only one race, the human race. But if you have dark skin color, so it's an advantage in one place, a disadvantage in other places. So if you live too far from the equator, that dark skin becomes a disadvantage because of vitamin D production. On the flip side, if you're, I'm of Irish descent, so if you're, especially one of my brothers, if he lived near the equator, he'd be in deep, deep trouble. But if you put him in the Scandinavian countries, he can make enough vitamin D to stay healthy. So the fact that there are different variants of human genes, these alleles, is what allows there to be some selection pressure. And the genes that are fitter in that situation, that environment, are better. So if you ask me if a gene is a good thing, if a trait is a good thing, the answer is always it depends. It depends on what environment you're talking about. So, all right, and that's the third is that third key element is that evolution is unpredictable and natural. So we'll talk about natural selection here in just a moment, but it is random chance. So now natural selection definitely can help choose which species survive and which ones are most adapted to their environment. But the mutations and the changes in genetics that led to new species or new variants were completely random. So we talk, mutation. When you hear the word mutation, you always think bad thing, but that's just not the case. A mutation is just a change in DNA. Every once in a while, that's a good thing. So, but these unpredictable mutations, it's just you're just playing the lottery. And, obviously, I like to use the lottery analogy because most of the times when you play the lottery, you lose, but occasionally you win. So most mutations are bad, or, lethal mutations that make you less fit and less likely to survive and reproduce, or neutral mutations that really don't matter, like whether you have fixed or free earlobes shouldn't matter, these kind of things. But every once in a while, there are beneficial mutations, and it just depends on the environment you're in. So but there is this randomness to it. You could be the healthiest fish in the pond, and that pond can dry up. It doesn't matter. Or you could be pretty inferior genetically. Let's say if you're a fish in a neighboring pond, but the healthiest, most fit genetic fish in that pond got eaten by a shark, or a rock fell on, or something. So there is some randomness to it. All right. Next point, is natural selection the same thing as evolution? No. Natural selection is this selection pressure, the survival of the fittest, where nature chooses which traits are most beneficial. But like I just mentioned, it is still random. You could have the best genetic profile and still be the one that gets eaten by a hawk or falls to your death, these kind of things. But over time, the more fit, this one's like, all right, sorry, I can't remember exactly where I was there, but just, so natural selection is the fact that the fittest organisms are more likely to survive. So you can't guarantee it. That's this whole idea of survival of the fittest. For evolution to work, the fittest, properly, the fittest members of the species are going to have more opportunities to survive and reproduce than the less fit. So really, survival of the fittest and death to the unfit. Okay, sorry again. He's such a sweet boy. He's going to go to the wading pool with his grandpa so that he'll be gone, but he has a hard time with me working from home. Just to quickly review, because there has been some interruptions. So what is evolution? I really just, to me, descent with change over time, or descent with modification, is the best way to define evolution. Over time, organisms are going to descend from one another, but there's going to be slight modifications. Modifications that lead to advantages are going to become more common. Disadvantages, less common, and possibly heading towards extinction. The three key elements we covered pretty deeply there. There is descent over time, so we have time, and there are most genetic material, our traits are passed on. So over time, traits that are beneficial are going to become more common. Genetic modification, that there are differences between us, and that's why they can be, whether it's us or I keep talking about humans, but it could be bacteria or anything. A bacteria that has a survival advantage is different than one that doesn't, and it will survive, or is more likely to. Like when your bottle of Lysol says it kills 99.99%, well, that 0.01% is the survivor because it's different, because of genetic differences or genetic modification. And then the fact that it's unpredictable and natural. There is artificial selection. That's what breeding is. So when you breed animals, you are artificially choosing the traits you want. The dairy cows that produce the most milk, or a dog with a certain color. That's actually, Darwin was a pigeon breeder. I think they were called rock pigeons that he worked with. So a lot of his theory actually came from artificial selection or breeding. So I don't want to get into too much of him as a man, but he took a lot, especially in his later works after On the Origin of Species. He really a lot of his theories are what you could say guided the eugenics programs and people like Hitler, because he did believe, from his breeding experiments, that the worst breeder in the world wouldn't keep their quote unquote worst stock around, and he didn't really believe in helping people that he deemed inferior, these kind of things. So I don't want to get too much into that. I'm just teaching you the basics of the theory. So is natural selection the same thing as evolution? No, it's part of it. It's evolution by natural selection would be what we would say. So natural selection is the environment says your traits are good, yours are not. Let's look at a human example would be lactose tolerance, or really what they would say, lactase persistence, the ability to drink milk as an adult. All babies are supposed to be able to drink milk, their mother's milk, but then there really, for most of human history, there wasn't a reason to keep that around when you quit drinking breast milk and moved to food. But then now you will see that more human beings can drink milk as adults now than ever. So that is actually evidence of some evolution. So why is that? Well, natural selection says if food is short, if you go back 10,000 years ago in Europe and 7,000 years ago in Africa, this is where these traits started to show up. If you live somewhere where there was food shortages and you could drink milk and the people around you couldn't, you had a clear survival advantage. You were less likely to die of starvation. You were more likely to survive long enough to have children, and your children are more likely to survive. So literally, the ability to consume a new food source is a perfect example of the So selection pressure says when food is short, if you can drink milk, you're going to have a survival advantage. If you have the genes for lactase persistence in a part of the world where no one consumes milk. There's no pressure. There's no advantage there. So if you ask me, is the ability to tolerate lactose as an adult an advantage or a good trait? The answer is always it depends for that reason. So all right. What are some of the key pieces of evidence for evolution? That's actually going to be these next few points. I mean, one of them is the fossil record. So the fossil record is, like the name implies, the record of fossils that we have. So fossils, certain parts of organisms, basically when an organism died, if it was quickly covered in something like mud or soot or something, and so before it could be decomposed, it was preserved, and then over time, the hard parts of the organism are almost always hard parts, bones and teeth, these kind of thing, would have been replaced by, became mineralized and basically became rocks. So fossils are rocks that preserved parts of some species. So that's the fossil record. But the next question, why is it so incomplete? Well, only hard things like shells, and there are some fossilized fecal material, and they have found a few like fossilized guts and stuff. But the fossil record is so incomplete because of what I just said. Most organisms weren't going to die and then quickly be covered up before they could be decomposed. So most things that have ever lived were decomposed and couldn't become fossils. So they would have had to have been covered, and then even then, only the hard parts are usually what are preserved. So that's why it's so incomplete. But so that's the fossil record and what it is. What is comparative anatomy and biochemistry? So comparative anatomy and biochemistry would be two other good evidences for evolution, and that is the fact that if seemingly distinct or seemingly different organisms have very similar structures, you could in many cases make an argument that they came from a common ancestor and they just diverged. Same thing with biochemistry. The fact that we share the same like electron transport system proteins as bacteria means that we had a common ancestor. So comparative anatomy and biochemistry are when you look at either the anatomy, the structure of organisms, or their biochemistry, and try to find evidence of common ancestors. So I'll bring up some more specifics here in just a moment. So what is common ancestry and how do we determine it? Well, that's basically what I just said. If you and another organism have something in common, then you probably have a common ancestor. So if you look at, let's just use the next point here, homologous versus analogous structures. So homologous structures, like in the book, it talks about how, the human arm, dogs, whales, and birds were the four examples given in the book, and there's a lot of similarities in the bony structures of their upper extremities. So what that would say is that's homologous structures, which means they came from the same place. Now they're different because they serve different purposes. We use our arms way differently than a whale would use their equivalent, and a bird would use their equivalent. So they're not the same, but they have enough in common that we believe they came from the same place, this common ancestor. So that's homologous structures. Analogous structures are the opposite. If you look at if you compare a bird's wing to an insect's wing, they didn't come from the same place. So they would evolve completely differently. So the reason a bird has a wing and an insect has a wing is because wings are awesome and they allow for flight and movement. So, but they actually evolve from completely different places. So homologous structures, we believe, came from a common ancestor and evolved from one place. Analogous structures, the structure has such an important use that it evolved multiple times. So, all right. So that's common ancestry, how we determine it. Again, we use comparative anatomy and comparative biochemistry to determine it. And then we covered homologous versus analogous structures. So what is a vestigial structure? So this is going to be an organ or a structure with little or no function in an organism. So I don't think a lot of the vestigial structures that they talk about, aren't super important to me, but that's what that term means. So, let's see, in humans here, when I flex my forearms, I can see this tendon right in the middle of my wrist. That means I have a muscle called the palmaris longus. Well, not all humans have that. So it primarily would be important if I was swinging through trees like other primates. So that's so you don't have to have it. You can have a fully functional forearm. You can do pull-ups. You can lift weights. You can do whatever you have to do without it. So that might be considered one. Some I don't like the whole idea of gill slits and these kind of things. But that one's a good one. There are organisms that can't even see that have structures that could be used for vision. Some I don't like the appendix. We now know the appendix actually has quite a few functions. It helps develop the immune system, these kind of things. So, but I just need you to know what the term means. A vestigial structure is a structure that used to have a function or now has very less of a function or no function at all. But some of the big ones they use in humans I don't like the idea of a tailbone. They call it a tailbone, but your coccyx, your sacrum and your coccyx, there's 17 muscles attached to it. You couldn't have a bowel movement or stand up without it. So to call that a vestigial structure, or to call the appendix a vestigial structure when it clearly has functions, I don't really like that. But that's what the word means. All right. Where does extinction fit into evolution? So I've already mentioned this. You are either evolving or heading towards extinction. If me and you are members of different species, we'll talk about what a species is, at the last point actually, if you and me are different species and we're in the same area and we're fighting over the same resources, same location, same food, etc., and your genes are superior to mine, you're more adapted to that environment than me, well, you're going to evolve and become more common, these kind of things, and I'm going to head towards extinction. So extinction is when a species just can't adapt to its environment. If either the environment is changing too fast or the species is changing too slow, if a species cannot adapt to its environment, it will go extinct. Now, extinction could be local or it could be worldwide. Like the dodo birds are just gone, but it could be localized extinction you're talking about as well. But that's what extinction is, when you just no longer fit with your environment, you're going extinct. That's why, from an ecological standpoint, I'm all about helping animals. We talk about save the whales and save this and that. To me, it's all about save the habitat, save the soil, these types of things. Because if you try to keep a species that's teetering on extinction alive, but doesn't have a suitable habitat, if it's not suited to its environment, then what's the point? So I always like to say, look at the bottom of the food chain. Let's keep those areas healthy, and then the larger organisms, like these beautiful animals we watch on National Geographic, they'll sort themselves out. So if you want to save the whales, of course, we need to stop hunting whales. We're top predators that are killing them. But if you want to save them, save the plankton, save the water, save the water pH, these types of things. Whales can take care of themselves as long as we leave them alone. All right. What is an evolutionary tree? And then that ties to the next point. What is adaptive radiation? So an evolutionary tree is where we try to tie together who are our common ancestors, where did we come from, where did they go, these kind of things. So it's another name for it is a phylogenetic tree. So it's actually just it's a tree-like structure that shows changes over time and who we're more closely related to, who we're less closely related to. So adaptive radiation you're going to see on one of these trees. So when the conditions are right and a bunch of new species show up at a single time, or in a short amount of time, from a single ancestor, that's called adaptive radiation. You might see that on islands. There are certain environments where you're going to see that where conditions are just ripe for new species to pop up. So if a part of the tree has a branch with a bunch of little branches on it, that's called adaptive radiation. All right, obviously a lot of huge topics we're covering here in just a cursory view, but what are some of the key steps in life's beginning on Earth? So you have to go to, beginning, we had to get the Earth. So, the beginning of the universe, let's say 14 to 16 billion years ago, and then Earth shows up about 4.5 billion years ago, but it's, way too hot. There aren't any living organisms for quite a while. So 3.8 billion years ago would be when we believe the first living organism showed up based on a fossil record and the evidence we do have. So that's kind of where it all begins, these first cells. So before that, we would have had just like organic molecules and maybe cell building blocks. And then we had self-replicating DNA and RNA first. So most of the hypotheses that you see more often now are that the self-replicating RNA might have been, where life began. So we had basic building blocks of cells. Then we had the genetic blueprint for cells, whether it was DNA or RNA. Then we had the first cells. So the first cells would have been anaerobic. There wasn't oxygen in the environment at this point. So once the Earth cooled, we're looking at these organic molecules would have formed in an environment probably full of nitrogen, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, these kind of things. And then cells start to form. So these first cells couldn't have relied on oxygen because they didn't exist, wasn't in the environment. Then photosynthesis shows up. So let's see, we talked about cell precursors. That'd be these organic molecules. And just so you know, organic molecules, just carbon-based molecules. The first cells would have been these anaerobic cells. Then we had your first self-replicating cells, so cells that actually could divide and reproduce. And then these simple prokaryotic cells, or simpler, sorry, there's no such thing as a simple living thing. These simpler prokaryotic cells evolved into the more complex eukaryotic cells like yours. So why is photosynthesis a precursor to aerobic metabolism? Well, photosynthesis had to show up because even today, photosynthetic single-celled organisms are still responsible for about 25% of the oxygen. So when we think of photosynthesis, you think of plants, but there are cyanobacteria and other microorganisms that generate a lot of oxygen. So this early environment didn't have oxygen. Then the photosynthesis, by about 3 billion years ago, some cells became photosynthetic. So they were taking all these organic molecules from the environment, but their waste product was oxygen. So all of a sudden, oxygen starts to show up in Earth's atmosphere, and that's where aerobic organisms, like most bacteria that we care about anyways, like other eukaryotes, would have showed up. So without photosynthesis, you wouldn't have the oxygen you need for your aerobic oxygen-based metabolism. So plants have taken over more of that duty, but these single-celled organisms, these more prehistoric cells, still play a role. All right, let's see. Skipping ahead so then we make a huge jump, obviously, from photosynthetic single-celled organisms to humans. But so humans, we're mammals, we're primates, if however you want to look at it, but so what is it? So primates are going to be mammals that have 5 digits on their hands, generally have flat fingernails and toenails, and we don't have hooves or claws, talons, that kind of thing. So so yes, we're mammals, yes, we're primates, but the best term for, if you're going to be looking at humans and where we fit, would be hominoids. So because that's a subgroup of primates, but have really big brains. So also don't have tails. So I would say the other big thing with hominoids versus other primates would be, so the big brains, no tails, and generally more social behavior. So all those are correct. So to say that humans are mammals is correct, to say they're primates is correct, and to say we're hominoids is correct, but that would be the most specific one there. So, all right, so what is a species and what is taxonomy, just to tie up this chapter here. So taxonomy is the naming system we use. It's the classification and naming system we use to, like terms I just used, to see where do humans fit, where do other species fit. So taxonomy is this classification / naming system that tries to put every organism in its place. And that uses things like comparative anatomy, comparative biochemistry, all those things. So that's what taxonomy is. And then what is a species? So I think this is important. There's a very specific definition for what a species is. So you and another organism are in the same species. Well, I guess if you're of the opposite sex, whatever. But a species is a group of organisms that can breed, that can produce offspring that are fertile. So that's a big, so like you can have a llama and a camel can reproduce. They can create a lamel, but that is sterile. The lamel is sterile. What is it, a mule? I'm trying to remember now. What is it? A horse and a donkey make a mule, but a mule is sterile. I might be getting those mixed up. But see, a horse and a donkey are not members of the same species, or a camel and a llama are not members of the same species. They're close because they can actually reproduce. Their parts fit together. Their cells work together. Their sex cells work together, but they don't produce fertile offspring. So you have to be. So you are a part of a species if you can breed with other members of that species and produce fertile offspring. So that's that second part is a key part of the definition of a species. Okay, chapter 23. All right, chapter 23 is about ecosystems and populations. So a lot of terminology here, but very important terms. So what is ecology to start off? So ecology is a study of the relationship between living things, the organisms, and their environment. So really, that's what an ecosystem is, which is the next one. An ecosystem is the living and non-living component of an area. So ecology is a study of ecosystems, if you think of it that way. And then what is a biosphere? A biosphere is when you put all the ecosystems on the planet together. So they call it a planetary ecosystem. So you have all different kinds of ecosystems, throw them all into one pot. That's the biosphere. Next terms here, population versus community. So Pretty simple differences. Apologize for that. A population is all the members of one species or a group of individuals of the same species in a given area, whether you're talking about a small area or a huge one. A community is all the organisms or all the populations in a given area. So a population is all the members of one species in a given area. A community is all the members of all species in a given area. So I'm sitting here in Sioux Falls right now. So the population of Sioux Falls would be, I don't even know what it is, but I think it's according to the sign I see when I drive into town, it's about 180,000 people. That's how many people live in Sioux Falls. The community of Sioux Falls would count, I mean, if you wanted to count roaches, but dogs, cats, fish, I mean, all bats, all living things. So that's the difference in a population and a community. So a habitat is just where a species lives. So it's the home. All right, I think I got all those. Let's see here. Ecosystem, but yeah. Excuse me, frog in my throat. Okay. What are the key types of population growth rates, including exponential growth rates? So really, we're talking about one thing here. We have exponential growth would be the fastest an organism could grow, and that would be if it reached its biotic potential. So if there was nothing stopping an organism from reproducing as fast as possible. So they produce as many offsprings as possible. They all survive, all these kind of things. That would be this exponential growth rate. Then you have the actual growth rate. So the actual growth rate would be how things really work out. You know, if you look at an example I use in microbiology, one E. coli bacteria could become a pile of bacteria weighed as much as an aircraft carrier, which I think is like 83,000 tons or something ridiculous, in 25.5 hours. So it clearly doesn't happen. Even things that are very contaminated, we'd be living on a planet a mile deep with E. coli, except for the fact that most of them die. So actual population growth is way different than exponential population growth. So, all right, and then so what is carrying capacity? And then how do limiting factors, that should say how do limiting factors play a role? Well, that leads to the next question too. What is environmental resistance? So the carrying capacity is how many organisms can an area carry? So how many deer can live in a forest? Well, that would be its carrying capacity. So the things that influence carrying capacity are going to be this environmental resistance, which I like to use the term limiting factors, but we're basically talking about the same thing. So let's say I don't care if it's bacteria in a petri dish. There's only so much room, so much food, and so much waste products that can fit in this petri dish. So that would be these limiting factors or the environmental resistance. So an organism wants to reach its biotic potential. It wants to grow exponentially, but the environment fights back and says, we cannot do this. We can't, so that's where things like predators, when populations get really big, there's going to be more diseases, whether they're respiratory diseases that affect fertility. If there's a bunch of prey in an area, that's going to bring in a lot of predators, all these kind of things. So that's the idea of environmental resistance, and then how limiting factors are going to determine the carrying capacity. So we could ask, and I do ask it later, but the whole idea, with humans, actually I'll save that discussion for human population growth later. Okay, so what is biomass? Biomass is all the total living component in an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is the living and non-living component. So the biomass is the living component. So whether from soil organisms to top predators, that's what your biomass is. All right, next section here: energy flow through the ecosystems and living organisms. So the key thing here, I'm sure you've heard of food chains and food webs, and we'll look at all these terms like herbivores and stuff. But from an energy flow standpoint, it's important to know that every time you go from one level to the next, and these levels are called trophic levels generally. So when you go from like your producer to your primary consumer, only 10% of the energy can be passed on. So that means that 90% of the energy is either lost in the form of heat or used by that organism. So if you think about the sun, the sun, it powers these producers. Well, not all sun's energy powers producers. Most of it is lost in the form of heat. So, but then when if you want to eat, let's say it took 1,000 calories of energy for a plant to make 100 calories of food that you could eat. But then it took 1,000 calories of plant energy to make 100 calories of animal energy you could meet. So that's this number, this 10. So every time you go from one level to the next, only 10% of the energy is still available. That's why food chains and food webs aren't too big, or a food chain doesn't go too deep. You're rarely ever going to see like a quaternary consumer. What that means is like a real top level carnivore. And if you do see them, they're super rare. There's only so much food to go around. If you eat the animals that eat the animals that eat the animals that eat the plants, you can see there's not a lot of energy to go around. So you'd have a hard time surviving. That's why this whole energy flow idea is so important. Now, I don't want, this, you could make an argument here then that, I don't want to get too deep into this, but you can make an argument here for a more plant-based diet because do you grow 1,000 calories worth of grain and eat that grain, or grow 1,000 calories of grain to feed it to a cow to make 100 calories a cow? Well, it's not near that simple. So biologically, I think we are supposed to be eating meat. And the reality is the majority of the land on this planet cannot be used to grow crops like grain. So I personally think that we're missing the boat because our animals, our herbivores should be grass-fed. They should be living on grassland that doesn't influence, that we wouldn't grow agricultural crops on. But you can shoot me an email if you want to talk about that. All right, so producers versus consumers. Like the name implies, producers can produce their own energy, whereas consumers have to consume it. So the other terms you might hear, a producer is also called an autotroph, which means self-feeder. So if you give a plant water, soil for the minerals, but basically water and sunlight, and carbon dioxide, it's able to make its own food. Now it has to then burn that food and use that food. Like, we know plants make their own fuel, but they still have to burn it like we do. But that's why they're called producers or autotrophs, self-feeders. Consumers are also called heterotrophs, other feeders. So we can't make our own chemical energy, so we have to eat it. So that's what makes us a consumer, whereas a plant would be a producer. So these other terms, I'm assuming you've heard of most of these, but so herbivores, they only feed on plants. So these are called primary consumers. So they only eat the producers. So, all right, then we have your carnivore on the other end. Carnivores feed only on other animals. So these would be secondary, tertiary, which means third level, or quaternary consumers, depending on how many other carnivores there are in the area. So usually you'll have a lower level carnivore that's a predator on smaller species. Then you have higher level carnivores that can be predators on them. But you rarely ever see that quaternary level consumer because of what we mentioned before with the energy stuff. All right, so that's an herbivore and a carnivore. An omnivore is going to be in the middle. They can eat both plants and animals. So humans we're omnivores. So, and one you don't hear about a lot is decomposers, but they're very important. This chapter talks about the biogeochemical cycles, or I teach in my microbiology class. The benefits of having microbes around. Decomposition is very important. So they feed on dead organisms. So this could be a lot of your bacteria, earthworms, some insects, etc. The reason this is so important is if it weren't for decomposers, all the elements on the periodic table, there's a finite amount of carbon in the universe and things like that. All the elements, all the atoms we need to build new living things would be trapped in old dead things. So decomposers are at every level. So there are decomposers that decompose decaying plant matter. There are decomposers that, every single level in these food chains, there's going to be decomposers. And they're really important. Their key role is then to recycle elements, to recycle nutrients. Just imagine if all the vitamins and minerals was trapped in old dead organisms, rather than, then we wouldn't have them for us. All right, food chain versus food web. I'm not even sure if the book talks about food chains at all. But so a food chain, it would be a single line up and down that has the producer and then your primary consumer, your secondary consumer, whatever. So it'd be a producer which has an herbivore and then an omnivore above it and a carnivore above it. So food chains are real simple when you're trying, which is what we basically just did, herbivore, carnivore, omnivore kind of thing. They're very simple. It's a great way to teach this, but in reality, ecosystems are much more complex than that. So a food web is you take all these individual food chains and interconnect them. That's what a food web. So it shows the feeding relationships. Who eats whom? So the book has one where you see, so you could do a single food chain here, but in reality, they're food webs. So I'm looking, just happen to be looking at the book here. So if I'm a prairie vole, it looks to me like snakes, weasels, badgers, coyotes, all of them can eat me. So there's not a single food chain. So the food web is this kind of this interconnected web of who eats whom. So at the top of the one in the book, so you've got the producers, which are plants. They show a wheat field. Your primary consumers, which would be your herbivores. Your secondary consumers usually are omnivores. And then you have primary, secondary, tertiary consumers that can be carnivores too. But then at the top, you usually have that top carnivore, which in this example is a hawk. All right, so the trophic levels, that's what I call these feeding levels. So you don't see the terminology used here, but each of these levels is going to be a trophic or feeding level. So the primary consumers is one trophic level, the secondary consumers is the next one. So, all right, and that ties into the ecological pyramids the book talks about as far as where the energy's at. So the example they use in the book here is that it takes 1,000 units of energy in producers to get 100 units to the primary consumer, to get 10 units to the secondary consumer, to get 1 to the tertiary consumer. So that's why you rarely ever see a quaternary consumer. You rarely ever see a food chain like the one here in the book. I'm looking at page 531 now. You rarely ever see a food chain that goes that 5th level, because it took 1,000 units of energy to have 1 left for that top carnivore, that hawk. All right, so those are your trophic levels and how they tie into that. So the biogeochemical cycles, just real big picture here. We talked about how, the fact that elements and resources have to constantly be recycled and renewed. So I'm just going to give you the real Cliff Notes version here. So the water cycle is primarily going to be, evaporation versus precipitation. So water is pulled up and as it out of into the sky, and then it precipitates backwards. But this is important because this is how water cycles around the planet. So it doesn't just evaporate and drop right where it's picked up. So like, for example, water is picked up near the equator and then it drops either 30 degrees north or south on the globe, which is where your rainforests are. So it's a way that water can be moved and cycled throughout the planet. Carbon cycle is primarily going to be this balance between carbon that's in the water and the atmosphere versus carbon that's in organisms. So carbon dioxide primarily comes from our metabolisms. So living things release carbon dioxide from the food we eat, and then also from burning burning fossil fuels like coal, burning wood, these kind of things. Those are all going to release carbon dioxide. So before humans, the balance was pretty clear that carbon was released, but then also it was trapped in new organisms and as bicarbonate in the oceans and stuff. So it's pretty good balance. We've thrown this out of balance. The main thing you look at with almost all these cycles is how humans have kind of thrown them out of balance. So now we release. Think about when you burn a log. You could be burning. You're releasing CO2 that could have been stored for 100 years. When you're burning fossil fuels, you could be releasing carbon that's been stored for millions of years. So we put way more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we pull out. Nitrogen cycle, so I specifically mentioned nitrogen fixation because it's kind of cool. Just as far as, there's so much nitrogen out there, but the nitrogen that we need, we can't get from our atmosphere. So every time you take a breath, almost 80% of it is nitrogen. But nitrogen has to be fixated into a form where we can use it. So this is one of the many things that soil organisms do for us. They take nitrogen that's useless to us and they make it useful for plants. That's why as a human, when we need nitrogen, we get it from eating protein. So we get it from either eating plants that we're able to get it because of these soil organisms, or we get it from eating animals that ate those plants. So that's why nitrogen fixation is so important. And then phosphorus cycle, this is one where weathering plays a big deal. So most of the phosphorus that we have is going, now we have like phosphate fertilizers and these kind of things now, but most of the phosphorus comes from actually weathering of rocks. So rock is where a lot of this phosphorus is, and then as water, from rain and runoff and stuff, weathers rocks, and that's going to release phosphorus into the environment. So they're just kind of the Cliff Notes version of each of your biogeochemical cycles. Next, human population growth. Just this thought-provoking question: are there too many humans, or are they in the wrong place, or both? So there's not a real good answer to this question, but because you look at, there's enough calories on the planet for every single human to eat somewhere around 2,600, 2,700 calories a day. Countries like America, we throw away 35, 37 tons of food waste a year. So we really can't even say that there's not enough food. It's just that there's too much food in some parts of the world and too little food in other parts of the world. Just like there's, every human being on the planet could easily fit into maybe Florida, maybe just the southeast United States. So even from a land standpoint, there's enough land to go around. There appears to be enough food to go around. So I think the better answer here would be that a lot of it is that we're just in the wrong place. If you look at where population is growing, the worst part of that is that the population is growing really fast in parts of the world where they don't have enough money and resources and food, and it's growing really slow in parts of the world like here. We're all, if it weren't for immigration, we'd be at basically zero population growth, and we have tons of land and tons of food and tons of resources. So I don't know what you think about that. There's not a test question about that because we really can't answer it. So I don't think there needs to be 7.5 billion human beings for sure. I'm sure we would thrive at a lower population, I guess. But I think a big issue is primarily where people are, not so much how many of us there are. All right, so so if you look at the human population growth curve, you see this explosion around this 1700, give or take. There have been some dips in the past, and it's been steadily climbing before that. But so when did we start to see a rapid increase in human population, and what occurred at that time? So the rapid, the 1700s is when we had the Industrial Revolution. So that's the key. All of a sudden, we could produce a lot more food. People could survive. Less kids were dying and these kind of things. And that's when you saw the population explode. So the answer there is, in the 1700s because of the Industrial Revolution. So, so if you look at a population growth rates, you basically take births and subtract and births minus deaths, and we look at the net differences there. So if you have zero population growth, it means that births and deaths are equal. The fertility rate. So what is fertility rate, and then what is replacement fertility rate? So fertility rate is how many children is each woman having during their lifetime. So replacement fertility rate is 2.1. So if in a given area the average woman is having 2.1 children, that is the replacement fertility rate. That's because you have to replace mom and dad, and not everyone's going to have kids, so it has to be slightly above 2. So 2.1 is considered your replacement fertility rate. So fertility rate's gonna there's gonna be lots of factors here, but of course birth rates, death rates, how long people live, these things all have a big impact. Like if you look at China, you probably heard about like the one-child laws and these kind of things. Well, total fertility rate in China used to be over 5. So every woman was having more than 5 kids, and that's how there's well over 1 billion people in China now. So I don't want to get into how they decide to do these kind of things. Like if you're talking about population control, and you're talking about education and birth control, these kind of things, that's one thing. Forced sterilization and these kind of things, that's a whole another can of worms. But that's where the whole idea of bioethics comes into play. Like I'm a huge fan of biology and biological understandings. But bioethics says, let's not ever let science overtake our humanity, our morality, our ethics. So, because that's happened in the past. When you look at the eugenics program where they were forcibly sterilizing people, or these types of things. So that's a whole nother can of worms for a different class, but we're just talking about the numbers here. So these next two things, they're linked together. So what is age structure, and it's linked to economic development. So if you see the least, usually you use the terms most and least developed countries. So in the least developed countries, you're going to see really high birth rates, but then also low life expectancy. So it's going to look more like a traditional pyramid where there's lots of young people, and people don't live very long. So that's what least developed countries would look like. In your most developed countries, you're going to see less kids because we, like in the United States, we have less children than someone would have in Nigeria. So the base of the pyramid is going to be shorter, and it's going to stay. It's going to look more like kind of like the Empire State Building because people are going to live a lot longer. So you don't see that shrinking near the top. So that's going to be, it's really kind of a balancing of how many people live in an area that are reproducing and how many are not, either because they're post-reproductive years or they're young kids, that kind of thing. So that's what these age structure pyramids, if you want to call them, look like, or why they matter. Their link to economic development has to do with the fact that, again, if you're in a less developed country, you're going to see lots of kids, but not all of them are going to live, and you're going to see low life expectancy. So birth rates are high, but so are death rates. In developed countries like the US, you're going to see birth rates are low, but then so are death rates. So both of those situations are kind of balanced. So that's why I bring this last point here. What is a demographic transition, and what kind of problems come with it during the short term? So if a country, and I'm not saying you don't want countries to go from being less developed to more developed, but when a less developed country, high birth rate, high death rate. More developed country, low birth rate, low death rate. But then as a country kind of makes that leap from a less developed country to a more developed country, what you're generally going to see is you're going to see for a while a high birth rate and a low death rate, because less babies are dying because of vaccinations and drugs, so infant mortality goes way down. People are living longer, but they're still churning out kids as fast as they were before. So in this demographic transition, usually you see a population explosion. So some would say, like, maybe not the whole of Mexico, but Mexico City is going through something like this, where as you're starting to see improvements, cleaner water and better healthcare and stuff, you see the population starts to explode because you still have a really high birth rate, but the death rate is dropping. So that's a demographic transition, and that's why it can lead to these short-term problems. All right, lastly, chapter 24. Okay, so what are greenhouse gases, and what role do they play in global warming? So the greenhouse gases, most people don't know this because we always talk about carbon dioxide, but water vapor is the most important greenhouse gas. So that's, again, beyond our control, mainly beyond our control. So about 60% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are going to be water vapor. But then carbon dioxide is going to be a big one. Then methane, which is CH4, and nitrous oxide, and a few other ones. But the big ones are water vapor and carbon dioxide and methane would be the three that I would say are your primary greenhouse gases. So what is this greenhouse effect, and what role does that play in global warming? So like in a greenhouse where you use limited sun's rays to grow plants early and late in the growing seasons, the greenhouse gases don't actually stop the sun's rays from reaching the earth. But the infrared, the radiated heat that bounces off the earth after the sun's rays strike the earth, are going to be trapped. So the sun's rays can still get to the earth just the same. They can't leave. That's why it's called the greenhouse effect, and that's why it leads to global warming. So if water, whether it's CO2, water vapor, whatever, as greenhouse gases increase, you're going to see the temperature go up. So the sun's rays can still get in the atmosphere, but they can't leave the atmosphere. Some things are the opposite, like dirt, dust, soot, these kind of things. Like after a massive volcanic eruption, and you have a lot of other things in the atmosphere, they actually block the sun's rays from getting here. So after Mount St. Helens erupted in the 80s, the temperature actually went down. I think they said even in June or July there was even some snowing because the temperature dropped so much. So not everything in the atmosphere would lead to global warming, but the greenhouse gases do. All right, the two main human activities that have raised CO2 or carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are deforestation, so where we're removing plant material that could be used to sequester or store CO2 by chopping down a tree, and then burning fossil fuels. So like if you cut down a tree and then burn it, that's kind of a double whammy. You're releasing that carbon dioxide and you don't have the tree anymore. So that's why we're so concerned about the rainforest. But burning fossil fuels, I mentioned that earlier, when you're burning gas in your car or coal, you're burning up CO2 that's been stored for thousands or millions of years. So those are the two key human activities, deforestation and burning of fossil fuels. All right, what is the ozone layer, and what's the role that CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons play? So ozone is actually O3. So atmospheric oxygen that we breathe is O2. The ozone layer, there's actually two different places in the atmosphere where you're going to see a bunch of ozone. Ozone is actually created when you run an electrical current through oxygen. But so ozone is very important because this thin layer of ozone keeps out the most harmful UV rays. So you've got like UVA, UVB, UVC rays. But the harshest UV rays are actually kept out of, or kept away from us and our skin because of this ozone layer. So that's the role the ozone layer plays and why it protects us. So why are we concerned about it? Well, that's why we're concerned about it. But what role do these CFCs, these chlorofluorocarbons, play? So when I was a kid, this was a huge issue. I mean, obviously the ozone layer is still depleted, but some of the main culprits have been dealt with. I think this is actually one of the last examples of where we made a huge improvement in something. We solved the major problem. So the chlorofluorocarbons, these are these chlorinated compounds. They were used they used to be in aerosol cans, in styrofoams, refrigerators and air conditioners, these kind of things. But these so the chlorine atoms, that when they form, one chlorine atom can destroy something like 10,000 molecules of ozone. So that's where. So when I was in school, I remember being in elementary school. I mean, the legitimate concern was, maybe this is me being a kid, but there were concerns of, were we going to have to be like wearing hazmat suits or space suits to go outside? Are the UV rays going to be so dangerous we can't go outside? So that's why in the late 80s they phased out chlorofluorocarbons. So that's why you see your aerosol. If you have aerosol hairspray, it says has a CFC with a line through it, and they no longer use the chlorofluorocarbons to make your styrofoams and stuff too. So that's so really that was in 1987. By the time I was in high school in the mid 90s, this, not saying it was solved, the hole's still there, but it is stabilized. So that's pretty cool. This is an example of where we actually accomplish what we needed to accomplish. So that's what the ozone layer is, what ozone is. That's why we need it, and that's the role CFCs played in trying to destroy it. All right, water pollution and water scarcity. So I mean, this is a huge thing, but there are so many things that we need to be concerned about when it comes to water, pollution. There's PCBs, dioxins, there's all manner of things that can pollute our water. But let's talk about water scarcity first. So you look at the globe and think, how could there be water scarcity? 70% of the planet is covered in water. But you have to understand that 1% or less of it is actually potable, drinkable water. So most of the water on the planet is salt water, which we can't drink without desalinating it. And then so only about 3% of the water on the earth is fresh water, but then 2/3 of that is locked up in the polar ice caps. So 1% or less than 1% of the water that's on this planet we can actually drink. So of course there are processes that can desalinate water, but they generally take a lot of energy. So we don't want to be burning more fossil fuels to do that. So the main form of pollution that I want to talk about is this eutrophication. So if you put too many nutrients in water, things like, so especially here in the Midwest, you got like your nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers. When these fertilizers get dumped into the water, and they've studied them separately and together, and they find that the rate limiter is usually phosphorus. So if these phosphates or phosphorus-based fertilizers get in the water, you're going to see massive increases in life, and that's going to cause a lot of algae to grow. So algae blooms that can lead to fish kills and these kind of things. So that's eutrophication, when you put too many nutrients in the water and it causes an overgrowth of organisms that you don't want. So as far as another big point with water pollution is where these pollutants end up, and that is this idea of biological magnification. So simply put, biological magnification says the higher up on a food chain, the larger and higher up on a food chain an organism is, the more toxins are going to be stored in it, which makes sense, right? So if you look at the picture in the book, I think it talks about bacteria they're going to have tiny bits of pollutants. But if you're a plankton and you feed on bacteria, so you're getting exposed to the pollution in your water, plus getting it from your food. Well, if you're a fish that eats those plankton, you're getting exposed to pollution in your water, plus the food you're eating and the food they ate. So the higher you go up on a food chain, everything living in the water is being exposed to PCBs, DDT, whatever, but you're also getting it from your food. So that's why you're going to see this huge increase. Generally with biological magnification, they would say that at the top of a food chain, the concentration of toxins is millions of times higher than at the bottom. So that's the idea of biological magnification. So what does this mean for us? If you don't want to eat a lot of mercury, if you like eating seafood but don't want a lot of mercury in your diet, well, you should eat smaller fish that are lower on the food chain. So sardine is going to have way less mercury in it than, like, so if you look at the most dangerous animals to eat from a mercury standpoint, it's shark, swordfish, these, top of the food chain type organisms. Real big ones like, tuna can have a lot of mercury. So if you're eating small fish that have shorter lifespans and don't eat a lot of other fish, they're gonna have less pollution in them. So the other reason this is important for us to understand is because we are the top of the food chain. So we are accumulating toxins in ways that smaller organisms would not. This goes back to like the start of the environmental movement. Was a book called Silent Spring, and it was about, really it was a big deal, but it was about how, Silent Spring, the songbirds were dying, but it wasn't because of the songbirds. What was happening was the chemicals we were using, in the environment were basically poisoning the earthworms. Now, the earthworms didn't seem to be dying, but birds were eating up these worms like crazy. So the birds were getting doses of toxins that were enough to kill them. So songbirds were disappearing. That's why the book was called Silent Spring. But it's a clear example of the earthworms were getting exposed to toxins from eating leaf litter and things like that. But when it was the birds that really took the brunt of it because they were getting a higher dose of these toxins. All right, other types of pollution. So, groundwater can be polluted by things we put into, by things like oil and stuff that we put into the water. Environmental pollution can be caused by, industrial runoff, these kind of things. Lots of different pollutants. Some are living, some are, kind of our fault. Oil pollution. So this is something that, you probably think of big oil spills, and that's absolutely fine. Certainly when a pipeline is spewing out oil, that's a major problem. But a lot of oil actually is just kind of seeping into the water on its own too. So oil spills certainly make it worse, but that's when oil is spilled out of, I think, was the Horizon, what was it called? Deepwater Horizon. I remember there being a movie about it. When you're spewing oil out like that, that's certainly a problem. But there would be some oil in our water just naturally because of there being oil in the ocean. But so when there is, so like the book says, about half of the oil that actually enters the world's ocean every year just comes from natural seepage. It's called. So 30% of the total oil pollution is caused by oil disposal on land that gets washed out to the seas. So I'll be honest, when I was a kid, Dad used to change the oil and just dump it. So we now know we can't be doing that. And then 20% does come from accidents at sea, either oil spilling out of boats or pipelines, that kind of stuff. So when it gets there, a lot of it, about half the oil that is spilled is going to be degraded by bacteria. So it's really cool. There are some really important oil degrading bacteria that can help us clean up these spills. So, but they are serious problems. I'm not trying to diminish the fact that humans play a major role. We've got to be careful with oil getting into the water, but that natural seepage is a part of it. It's just kind of part of the cycle. There is oil there. All right, garbage. So you've probably seen that they have, these garbage barges or whatever you want to call them, these massive areas full of plastic and trash that are accumulating in the sea. So, this is definitely a big problem. The only good thing, I think the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is the biggest one, but the only thing that I can say is, thankfully the microbes are so good at evolving that we do have a couple hundred species of bacteria now that appear to be able to degrade plastic. So I think we're going to be able to get this cleaned up. We're going to be able to degrade this plastic, and hopefully these garbage patches won't be as big of a deal in the future. All right, let's see. Desertification and overuse. So we talked about deforestation before, but the problem is whenever you overuse. So if you go into a forest and chop down some trees, it's not that big of a deal. But on the edges of places where you have a lot of grasses, like they're called marginal lands that are near desert conditions, if you overuse those, if they're overgrazed or you take too many of the trees, you damage the soil too much, then basically that marginal land is going to become a desert or near desert conditions. So that's what desertification means. So we got to be really careful not to overuse the land we have, especially these what are called these marginal areas that are already kind of teetering. So now as far as what solutions are, that's a whole different story. Because I think, in the U.S. we may have the luxury to to let land rest and things like that. I mean, when I was a kid, that was a huge deal, that there was farmland that wasn't being used to kind of let it rest. But I don't know how to tell people living in places where they can't feed their kids if they don't use this patch of land not to use it. So becoming a parent has definitely changed my view on a few things. It's very easy to if you I don't know, just another example. Sorry for the digressions, but it's easy to say save the tigers or save the lions, these kind of things, because we see them on National Geographic, on Netflix or something, and they're beautiful. But if I live in a part of the world where that lion might eat my kid, that sucker's gone, or if I live on the edge of the rainforest and you're trying to save the rainforest, and if I can chop down three trees, and I can use that land to have another cow or grow some more corn to feed my family, I'm going to do it. We have to find solutions that are hopefully beneficial for everyone. So, all right, what are some of our energy options that will allow us to move away from unsustainable natural resources? So, I mean, nuclear power is clearly a tricky one, but where I live, and especially when I head into Northwest Iowa to teach, you're seeing a lot of wind farms. So, wind power can be a big deal. Solar power, these kind of things. I mean, so what are kind of these sustainable energy sources? Geothermal energy. Really, you can do things kind of like wind farms in the water, where ocean waves can generate electricity. So, what are the what are the renewable sources of energy? The sun's going to come up every day, so solar power is renewable. Using fossil fuels is not. No, we don't really know how much oil we have left, but I don't think I've ever seen anybody say we have more than 300 years worth left. Some would say 100 years. So the fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, these things are non-renewable. So when we run out of them, they're gone. So we need to find these renewable resources. So those are some of the options. All right, 2 more points here. We're at an hour. What is biodiversity? Why does it matter? And what role does habitat destruction play? So biodiversity is how, like the diversity of species, of living things. So if there's a lot of biodiversity, you're going to see a ton of different species in a given area. So we don't even know how many species there are. Like I've seen numbers between 1 and 10 million as far as how many different types of bacteria there are. We just don't know. There's 30,000 different kinds of beetles, these kind of things. So biodiversity would be that. The fact that, it used to be if you walked into an acre of land, whether it be rainforest or here, in the tall grass prairie, there might be 1,000 or more different species easily in an acre of land. Now what do we see? We're chopping down rainforest to grow canola or rapeseed. Look at our amber waves of grain. The entire Midwest is basically covered in corn, wheat, soybeans, and that's it. So why does that matter? Biodiversity is just, to me, it's a sign of the ecosystem health, because we know, that in order to do what we've done, in order to get as much corn as we can out of the land, we've had to use up most of our topsoil, use up most of the nutrients in the soil. Like, it's just not sustainable. So to me, I'm a big fan of what are called polycultures, or instead of these monocultures. And I don't know what the answers are, but diversity does appear to be important, and that's at every habitat, including the ones inside of you. Except for a few exceptions, you like from your microbiome, the bacteria living in your gut or on your skin, diversity is better. So at the microscopic level to the macroscopic level, that's what the biodiversity is, and that's why it matters. So what role does habitat destruction play? We destroy habitats. When we turn a forest into a parking lot, the habitat is the home for the living things. Well, there's no longer a home for living things. So habitat destruction is definitely going to alter ecosystems and alter biodiversity. So when we turn a forest or a tall grass prairie, which should have hundreds or thousands of species living in it, and we turn it into a cornfield, and we plow through and we kill all the snakes and mice and these kind of things, and we kill many of the soil organisms with the chemicals we use, that's not a good sign for the health of that ecosystem. So over the short term, it's a great way to make a lot of food, but I think it is a problem. All right, sustainable development, how to support it. So this, there are people that think we should just develop as much as we can right now, use the planet for what we can. There are others who think we have to stop developing or even move backwards. I don't think either of those are true. We need to continue to develop, and we need to continue to improve, economically. But we have to make sure that we're, like, as a dad, I look at the planet differently, being a father. I don't believe that that we're leaving a planet for our kids. I believe we're borrowing it from our children, right? So all the resources that we use are not going to be there for my children or my grandchildren. So we need to continue to develop and continue to have great economies and everything, but we have to make sure we don't leave nothing for future generations. So that's sustainable development. We can make a lot of money on this planet, but if the planet isn't even habitable at some point, what's the point? So that's what sustainable development is to me. How can we find ways to develop now that are good for the short and long term? I think that's the key. It's all about investing in the future. So if you take a skyscraper and you have a rainwater collection system, so will it take more money to build a skyscraper green, or to build it that way? Sure. But every month, as long as that building exists, you'll spend much less money on water. Or like solar power, it'll cost more money to put solar panels on the roof of a new industrial complex or something. I was just talking to my lab aide in the micro lab. The high school in Haiti where he's from is solar powered. The entire roof is solar panels. So did that cost more money? Yes. But every month they're saving on electricity, and we have to hope, and we have to hope that in the end it'll pay. So I think sustainable development doesn't have to slow progress. We have to be smart about it. We have to be creative, and we have to be investing in the future. But I think that that's the key. So how do you support it? I mean, I guess as an individual, we only vote one way that really matters to me, and that is with your wallet. So we have to demand better. So we have to we should buy from companies that we believe are doing right by the environment, these kind of things. But and certainly, I say, of course, voting matters, but voting with your wallet really matters. I don't care which side of the political aisle you're on. Money does talk in a capitalistic society. So you've heard the whole reduce, reuse, recycle. I think recycling is very important. Reusing stuff is very important, but that reduction is the key. So can we use less? So you ever, just little things, even like not letting the water run while I shave. I don't let the water run while I shave, or taking a 4-minute shower or a 10-minute shower versus a 30-minute shower. These kind of things. So can we use less? Can we recycle? So we use less or reduce? Can reuse when we can, recycle when we can? These kind of things. Buy from farmers that you think are being more sustainable. Do all these kind of things. So those are some of the ways you can support sustainable development. So hopefully you've learned a lot this semester. This is the end of our last unit together. Hopefully you watched all the videos that I've either made or found for this class. I think they're all really great. I've seen all of them myself or made them myself. And I hope you crushed this course, and I hope you learned a lot, and I wish you the best of luck moving forward.